God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. God only knows how it's killing you. But there's a kind of love that God only knows. God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. But God only knows the real you. There's a kind of love that God only knows.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 8 of Your Journey is Not Over. My name is Tanya Pearson Randolph. This is my own personal journey, and the expressions and opinions are of my own. I own all the rights to my personal journey and to Your Journey is Not Over. Neither are to be used, copied, or edited in any way without my consent. When I left off last time, I was on my second ride in an ambulance back to the very same community hospital that I just spent almost 3 weeks working so hard to get out of. It was like a deja vu at the first ride in the ambulance. I was hooked up to all kinds of monitors. And like before, my dad followed in his car and my mom stayed home. Getting unloaded at the hospital, again, my dad was right there. He looked confused and worried. I was rushed in and my doctors and nurses were waiting for me. Again, I got hooked up to IVs, monitors, and a catheter. So that meant I couldn't get up anytime soon. And I knew that. I'm sure everyone was confused because less than 24 hours prior, I was well on my road to recovery. I do remember being so frustrated and crying and trying to explain the best I could to my doctors and nurses. Literally, I had no explanation for them. I was as puzzled as they were. So, like before, an onset of tests begun. Only this time, I was going to be giving one of the most painful tests that I've ever had, even to this very day. It was a test that my doctor did not order for me the first time I was in the hospital. Truly, I don't know for sure, but I think my doctor was trying to find out what was wrong with me without putting me through this one painful test. But now, that test had to be done. So the very next day, I was scheduled for and I was put through a CFS test. It's better known as a spinal tap. It was very painful, and I had to be strapped down completely, which was traumatic for me because I'm very claustrophobic. But was again explained to me that it had to be done. After it was done, I had to lay on my stomach for 6 hours straight. I remember that was a challenge with the IVs and the monitors, and it was extremely uncomfortable. Again, my dad came to visit and brought a couple of my friends to see me. Of course, my friends were like, "What happened? I thought you were doing so much better." It was the same friends that had come to visit me on my very short stay at home. I didn't have no explanation for anyone, including myself. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't done anything different than what I'd been doing at the hospital. So the third day, my doctor, my attending physician, brought me breakfast. Again, hotcakes and sausage. And we had a long talk that morning. First, let me explain this. When you grow up like I had to, I was very codependent and I would latch onto anyone who cared about me, showed me kindness or love, sometimes good or bad. I would become easily attached. Notice how I use past tense? I've come a long way in my journey, by the way. But again, it was all that I knew. 99% of my life, this love or caring about me came from strangers. And that's who I would depend on, bond with. And through my life, it's been these people, good people, God's angels, that were sent into my life to help me, love me, and care about me. And like I've said before, yes, I've had a lot of people with bad intentions come into my life also. Those people were lessons along my journey. And I will always say this, the good most definitely outweigh the bad. So, with that being said, I had gotten close, extremely codependent on my doctors and my nurses. They were all I had at the hospital, and they spent so much time with me, helping me, nurturing me, caring about me, and loving me. They all gave me special treatment, and many of them would bring me food on their way into the hospital to work their shifts. I'm sure it was noted that I didn't have no visitors other than my dad and friends. I do remember during my first day at the hospital, my aunt came once. But other than that, no family. That's kind of how it was in our family. Anything with me and my brother was no big deal, or it was an inconvenience. But God forbid it be one of their kids. Our family would stop on a dime for others' kids. That treatment wasn't for me or my brother. We were made to feel like we were a burden, charity cases, like we didn't matter to the rest of the family. Again, no visitors, so my doctor and my nurses took on that task as well as their job with me. And now looking back and reflecting back, I now know my mom had convinced everyone, manipulated everyone, lied to everyone into believing that I was doing this to myself. And with thinking, being lied to, or believing that I was doing this to myself, there couldn't be much sympathy given to me, right? I didn't need anyone's sympathy. I needed love. I needed support. And I needed to feel loved. That's what I needed. And again, it was my dad, my brother, friends, and total strangers, which were my nurses and doctors, that provided that to me. Not my mother, not my family. It was my dad, my brother, my friends, and total strangers. So during this very early talk with my doctor that morning, he wanted some background on me, wanted to know where my dad, my real dad, was. So I remember telling him the bizarre story of how I was sent to Hawaii at 12 years old by myself to meet a man. And again, please remember at 15 years old, I was still lied to, into believing that the man in Hawaii was my real dad. With me being kicked out, always my way of saying how I had to leave Hawaii. He and I didn't get along. That was an understatement at this time. My brother, who, by the way, called me every single evening and had even kept in touch with my doctors, was in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and still in the Army. My grandma, she was gone to heaven. So I remember telling my doctor pretty much my life story, all the personal things about my life. And truly, I was thinking he needed to know these things to help him, to help me. This next morning was again something I was showed by the devil on that movie April 6th. And yes, it was excruciating for me to watch. And it's also something I had to come to terms with, had to face it, to heal it. Before I tell you about my next memory, I will say 5 years ago, my mother died. I wasn't even notified. Yes, trauma extends even into adulthood. So, no, I was never given that mommy dearest moment, is how I put it. You know, where my mother got to relieve her soul and her conscience and apologize to me for every single thing she ever did to me, every single thing she ever allowed to be done to me. Yes, I deserved and was owed that apology by my mother before she died. She and I both needed that. She needed it more than I. See, I forgave her for every single thing she had ever done or allowed to be done to me the last time I seen her and walked away for the final time. I forgave her completely, and that forgiveness wasn't just for her. It was for myself. I had to forgive her so I could go on, carry on, and try and find some much needed peace, some much needed balance, some well deserved happiness in my life. And which, shortly after I walked away from her, I did. And that's when I got with my now late husband. I finally had the unconditional love, the loyalty, the safety, and the most healthiest relationship I've ever had in my life. Everything I'd longed for my whole life. I got 8 wonderful years with my husband, and then God called him home. And well, I was led on my yellow brick road, my healing journey. I do place the blame on the people that were around my mother and taking charge of her on her last days. As I put it, there's a few more people that's going to answer and hear my name from God. Not to get too far ahead in my journey, but I was notified 2 weeks after my mother died, and she was illegally cremated. Yes, I was notified by a friend of a friend, and that person found out because one of my family members was out here informing total strangers of my mother's death. but didn't inform her own daughter. Just proves what I've said about my family. And there's a lot more to come on this when I get to that part of my journey. For now, I will just say, coming from a small town, it's a good old boy system. It's on who you know and who you grew up with. You can get anything done if you grew up with the right people. Even a discount, like my mother was a used car, on a legal cremation. But after her death, I had to get an attorney from another city, another county, and he began a deep dive for me. And what my attorney discovered, all these years later, completely floored me. It shattered me. And my naive, gullible self finally realized everything. It gave me clarity for this period of time in my life, no matter how hurtful it was. My grandma always said, what's done in the dark always makes its way to the light. Her traumatizing me extended well into my adulthood and even after her death. Like I said, there's a lot more to come when I get to that part of my journey. So, with that all being said, back to my memory. My doctor called my mom to the hospital. He wanted a formal meeting with her, not my dad. My dad, who had been made to take the lead as far as my health, my treatments, my progress, and was the only parent that came to the hospital to see me. No, my doctor wanted to see my mother face to face. He was along with two nurses in my room waiting for her arrival. I remember that day like yesterday. How could I ever forget it? I heard her high heels clicking, and just like when I had started my period and hemorrhaged and was in the emergency room almost 3 years earlier, I could tell she wasn't happy even before she made it to my hospital room. One thing about my mother, she didn't like to be made to do anything, especially when it came to her kids. She didn't like to be inconvenienced, put out in any way. And yes, that's probably why the family acted the way they did towards me and my brother. Our mother had us and used us to her advantage, and as a tool to get whatever she wanted or needed. Simply put, our mother had us and expected everyone to bow to, cater to, and do for her because of us. She wasn't happy when she herself had to be put out or made to do anything motherly. So the clicking of her high heel shoes told me she was mad before I even seen her, laid my eyes on her. She walked into my hospital room, and I remember the shock on her face when she seen my doctor and two nurses already in my room waiting for her. My doctor wasn't happy either. I had never seen him upset. He was a very calm, soft spoken doctor, but that wasn't his demeanor that day at all. Another thing about my mom, she didn't like to be caught off guard or confronted about anything. She had a persona about her that she walked on water, could do or say anything and get by with it. Could do no wrong. At least she had up until this point. My family members never confronted her. They never called her out. She had them all conditioned, lied to, and manipulated, or they were too scared to say anything at all to her. It got heated real fast because she was caught off guard and was being confronted. My doctor simply said, I know what's going on now. I know what's being done to this little girl. And I just wanted to tell you face to face that if something happens to this little girl when I release her from my care, I'm coming for you, her mother. It will be on you. Of course, she tried to be defensive and back my doctor down like she had everyone her whole life, but my doctor didn't budge, not 1 inch. He wasn't conditioned by her for years, wasn't manipulated, and damn sure couldn't be lied to by her. My spinal tap must have gave him all the answers that he needed. That one test ended the mystery of what was wrong with me. So after this confrontation between my doctor and my doctor told me he would see me later on, and him and one nurse left my room, and one nurse stayed. My mom was beyond mad. She was livid. And in front of that nurse, she told me with her teeth gritted, I was nothing but trouble, and how she wished she had never had me, and that I better not tell my dad. I was threatened so many times that day, which was so hard because I told my dad everything. The one thing she never knew as I told my brother the very first time I heard his voice after this. And because of me and the molestation, I had already ruined her life once. By the way, I got told that, got blamed for that, got told those exact words all through my adulthood. If it wasn't for me, she would have had a good life. I was even told this when I was 8 months pregnant with my youngest daughter. So, yes, I was told that, and she wanted me to feel guilty for what was done to me starting at 6 years old. I was just a baby, but in her mind, it was all my fault. That's another characteristic my mother had. She never accepted responsibility for her actions or anything she ever did. Like I just discussed with my mental health team, my mother never seen anything she did as being wrong. And her whole life, because everyone went along with, catered to her, she was never made to be accountable for her actions or to look in the mirror, so to speak. So even me being molested was my fault, not my mother's. As a parent myself, God forbid my kids would have ever had to endure anything like I did. I would have spent my entire life feeling guilty that my kids had to endure anything at all because their mother, me, made a bad choice. Again, I believe some people are born without a heart, a soul, and a conscience. It's the only way I can wrap my head or explain to myself why some people are like they are. And in this case, it was who I was born to. Yes, there were a lot more things said to me that day and in front of my nurse, which made it even more hurtful, humiliating, and embarrassing. I was immune to this behavior from her, but it still hurt me deeply. So after she said everything hurtful that she wanted to say, she left. So a couple days later, I was released. My doctors and two of my nurses gave me their home phone numbers in case I needed them. And again, my dad came and got me and took me home. Amazingly enough, I never had another pass out spell ever again. And slowly, I began to get back to normal, gain a little weight, go back to school. I couldn't take the steps at school. I had to ride the elevator to the second floor. They were just being really cautious with me. And I went back to the radio station, my jobs, friends. I just got on with it like I always had to do. That's all I knew. I just moved forward, carried on. This concludes my podcast for today. Please join me Thursday, listen in, and always remember your journey is not over. God bless.
God only knows what you've been through. God only knows what they say about you. God only knows how it's killing you. But there's a kind of love that God only knows.